So it is natural to feel anxious when you have an exam that is forthcoming. The mind will want to escape it. The mind will want to avoid the actuality. And yet the mind also knows that the only way you can truly be calm about that issue is to prepare diligently for the exam. It is the very same in death. Familiarity with any subject brings you comfort. Repetition will aid learning, and practice will make you perfect. Death is a natural life stage. It is the same as graduating or marriage. And therefore, I would urge all of you today to approach today's discussion not in a grim way, but with reflective open mind and with curious enthusiasm. The sun was setting and the sky was turning from orange to gray as I sat with my great-grandmother in the open courtyard on a charpoy in a house in Punjab. I was all of 3 years at that time. And as night fell upon us, my great-grandmother launched into an intense discussion about her own death with me. She explained to me in great detail how her body would be laid on the pyre, how someone would come and break her skull open in order to liberate her soul and set it free. And she explained to me the 10 portals through which the soul could find its escape from the body. Mind you, I was 3 years old. I was intrigued and fascinated by the conversation. And she was absolutely nonchalant. There was so much natural ease and poise when she spoke about it, as if it was the most ordinary thing. And I guess that is how it is meant to be. And yet, as I started to grow up, I became scared of death too. What I found was that the way people responded to death was so very dysfunctional. Even when somebody died at a ripe old age, there would be crying and wailing and chest beating, and everybody would behave as if some unforetold suffering fallen upon them. And so it was on the one side that I was fascinated and intrigued by death, and on the other side, there was terror and fright, which is why I decided to explore the subject in great detail. Now, you can't really study death without also studying life and the purpose of life. So why is it that we are born, and what is the purpose of our life here? And my study revealed to me that every human soul who incarnates into a human body does so with the primary intention of purifying its consciousness. We all come in with a certain configuration of 3 gunas. Whether we have good experiences or bad experiences, whatever we encounter is aimed towards the fulfillment of karma. We will either burn it or build it further. And the second aspect is to learn lessons so that we can become even more aware and more conscious. And we do all of this so that at the end of time, when it comes to dropping the body, when we are ready to exit this incarnation, we can leave with a lot more purity in our soul consciousness, with a greater degree of sattva and a reduced amount of tamas in our soul. That is the purpose of human existence. Now, how can we die in this way? How can we accomplish this human purpose? And for that, we need to practice the 3 C's. The first C is refining the color of the mind. The second C is about gaining greater control over the dying process. And the third C is clearing all the accumulations and assets that we gather and collect through our life. But before I jump into this intense conversation about the 3 C's, I would like to read a brief passage from my book, The 7 Karma Codes. So the very first thing you must know about the process of dying is that when the end of life approaches, the mind will have a tendency to cling tenaciously to the people and things it loved in that life. Regrets, resentments, and fears will overwhelm its heart. It will obsess about not having done enough for its loved ones and not having lived the life it wanted. Instead of thinking about God, who alone shall accompany it into the afterlife, the mind will get enmeshed with worldly attachments and all the other things that it is about to leave behind. This creates a great amount of fear and panic. If you wish to die in peace, 2 things must be accomplished during your lifetime. First, that you should have loved deeply, developing the virtues of forgiveness, fearlessness, and compassion. And second, you should have cultivated an intense desire and love for God so that your faith in Him is unshakable. If you can work tirelessly towards fulfilling these 2 soul commitments during your life, then when the time comes to bid farewell to your family here, you will do so with ease, knowing that you have served your loved ones well. With single-minded attention, you will then be able to reach for God's hand and depart from this earth fearlessly, knowing that you are safe in His hand. And now, if we can have the first poll to examine what all your fears about death are. Can we have the first poll, please? Whenever we start investigating or studying any subject that we do not know very much about, or something which we have no personal experience, a subject like death, it becomes really important that we research the subject and we refer to some renowned resources. The subject of death, dying in the afterlife, there are 3 very, very important and powerful resources. These are, in the Hindu tradition, there is something called the Garud Puran, which is a dialogue between Lord Vishnu and the bird he rides, the Garud, where in this dialogue he talks about rituals to be followed and the whole journey of the afterlife. Then there is the second resource, which is the Egyptian Book of Death, and a third, which is the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. 3 absolutely marvelous resources. They all have one central idea, and that central idea is that whatever we gather on life, through this life, on earth, must be left behind on earth before the moment of death, which really means that not just the physical things that we have gathered, but also the subtle things of the mind that we have gathered, all the feelings, all the emotions that we have collected. The Buddhists have a saying that whatever be the color of your mind today is what it is going to be at death. Now, a lot of people feel that when death arrives, suffering will be over and they will all find mukti. It's a word that is highly misunderstood. Mukti does mean the end of suffering, but death does not guarantee mukti. And let me explain to you why this is so. Every human mind comprises of the 5 koshas. So you have the physical body, which is made of the 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, space, the 5 Panchabhutams. You have 4 other subtle bodies, which is the etheric double. You have the emotional body, the mental body, and the spiritual and causal body. At the moment of death, the physical body or the corpse is laid on the earth in a symbolism to give the earth element back to it, to return it. The body is then washed with water to return it to the water element. It is then given to the fire, and from there it moves into air and space. And with that, the body disintegrates and dissolves. In the next 3 days, the etheric double, which is very similar to, it's a blueprint of the physical body, that also naturally dissolves. But the emotional body, the mental body, and the spiritual causal body, these move into the afterlife with the soul. Now, what is contained in these bodies? Whatever be the color of your mind, if it is dark and gloomy, whatever unresolved emotions you have, whatever hurtful thoughts, feelings, whatever beliefs, whatever deep-seated ideas about life or about what people have done to you, all of these things are contained in your emotional and mental bodies. If the mind is gloomy, agitated by emotions, if there are worries, if there are stress, if there are concerns, then that agitation is what you will experience more powerfully after the death. So let us just examine for a moment. If you still today feel any kind of shame, what it indicates is that you have not forgiven all of those people who humiliated you in the past, and that shame is still trapped inside of you. If you feel any kind of guilt, it means that you have not forgiven yourself for errors committed. If you feel apathy, it means you're disconnected with yourself. There is hopelessness and despair in the heart. If you feel grief, it means there is clinging to attachment. If there is anger, it means that you're stuck in raga dvesha, in likes and dislikes. If you're overcome by desire, then you are still crippling with craving. If your pride gets hurt even today, then you're enslaved by the ego mind. And you can see how all of these things are only going to make your mind dark and gloomy. And the objective is that we make our mind light, which means we have to give away, we have to resolve, we have to dissolve, we have all of these feelings in order to gain entry into heaven. What is heaven? Heaven is the end of suffering. This is the reason a lot of times people don't want to discuss the subject of death, because somehow in their childhood they've heard stories about the hells and they're worried that I don't know where I'm going to go after I die. It's the big unknown, and I've heard of the hells and I've heard of heaven. Heaven and hell is only the experience of suffering or the experience of freedom from suffering. And unless you can be free of all of these emotional and mental sufferings while you're still in the body, you cannot be free of it in the afterlife. In fact, you feel it in a more exaggerated self, because there is no personality or coping mechanism to disguise it. You can't repress these emotions. You can't hide from them. You can't escape them. You can't go watch a movie and amuse yourself. So you have to face those emotions finally and suffer them in the afterlife. Now, if all of us knew that we have worked really hard and we have actually improved the color of our mind and we are going to go to heaven, I'm sure we wouldn't be so scared of dying. In the Egyptian Book of Death, there is a very detailed protocol about what is required to find the passage into heaven. At first, the innocent person needs to make 42 negative declarations that he has never committed any error or any sin. They are very similar to the 10 Commandments. And after they have made those declarations, they have to provide proof of their innocence. Apparently, their heart is weighed against a single feather from the plume of goddess Math. And if the heart is found to be as light as a single feather, they are given admission into heaven. If not, if the heart is heavy with all of those emotions I just spoke about, or if the heart is heavy because it has done some misdeeds, then it is just eaten up by the awaiting Amit over there. So the question that arrives, therefore, is what can we do to have a rainbow mind and a feather-light heart? That is the preparation we need to make to be able to die with a calm mind. And that requires the daily practice of golf. Now, I am not referring to the game here. I have designed this acronym so that all of you can remember it. And it comprises of 4 things. The G in the golf, the first one is pursuing inner growth. The second one, O, is our relationship with others. L is for the legacy, and F is for faith. So I'm going to first talk about pursuing inner growth. Bronnie Ware was an Australian palliative nurse who worked with terminally ill patients for over 15 years. She stayed with them in the last 3 to 12 weeks before their death, and she had some really intense conversations and dialogues with them. She curated these, and what she found was that most people, when they approached their end, they had some deep regrets about how they had lived their lives. And she decided to make a list of these and share it with the world. And the top 5 regrets were, I wish I had the courage to live the life that I truly wanted. I wish that I hadn't worked so hard and I had spent more time with my family and children. I wish I had the courage to express all my feelings freely. I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. And I wish that I had allowed myself to be happy. And they realized that happiness was a choice to be made. These 5 top regrets were then translated into a best-selling international book, which has been widely read by people. I think each one of our lives are very unique, and it is very important that we actually reflect on what are our deep regrets. What is it that we really wanted to do in our lives, but we've been unable to do them for whatever reason? And having reflected on these, we try and make corrections in the days that are left in our lives. We all know that death can arrive anytime, much as we'd like to believe it won't come to me so quickly, but we don't know it. And particularly during this era in the corona phase, where I find that it has nothing to do with age anymore. I find young and old just dropping like pins these days. So perhaps it's a relevant time for us to reflect on what regrets we have and make good those regrets. Which leads me to the second aspect of personal growth, which is draw up your bucket list. All your unfulfilled dreams. And you will find as I go through today's discussion that this is so important. Now, some of you might be thinking, ab to itni umar ho gayi, ab kaun si dreams fulfill karni hai? And to you people, I would urge you to just believe me when I say there are many flowers that bloom in late spring, even when the sun is setting. So you may be a late bloomer. You may not have had time before because you were stuck in existential crisis, in earning for your family, raising the kids, etc. But there are enough people that I can talk about who are doing things at much older ages. I have a couple of friends who at age 45 have now gone back and enrolled into first-year college to study a course that they really wanted. Both of them have enrolled into psychology, and they happen to be the oldest students in their class, but they just felt that this was a subject that they really wished that if they relived their life, then this is a subject they would study. And so they've gone back to college. We have another very interesting idea of this lady, an old 90-year-old grandmother in Delhi, I think, whose desire was that to earn her own money. She said, I've never earned a penny in my life, and before I died, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. She has now become the hot burfi selling auntie, and she is doing a raging business at 90 years of age. There was another lady in Mumbai who, again, an elderly 85-year-old who started stitching cloth bags. She stands for 3 hours every day at her machine, and she stitches these cloth bags from old clothes, recycling them into bags, and they are sold online. And it went pretty viral last year. I also read about this artist in her 90s, and she said that this lady was in the US. She said all the friends and relatives that she knew, her peer group, everyone had died. And when her husband finally died, who was the last of her cohort, her relatives, her known people, she became really lonely and she didn't know how she was going to live thereafter. So she started painting. She went on to become a really good artist with her art selling like hotcakes at her gallery. So all of you, think about what are the things that you wanted to do when you were younger? What were your childhood dreams? And maybe you still have time to go fulfill them. Then there is the third aspect about accept what you can't change. Very often we have this attitude where we look at life through the perception of loss, not through the perception of gain. And when it comes to aging, there is one thing that really bothers all of us, which is the failing faculties. You know, the eyesight starts to get weak, the hearing gets difficult, and it brings a lot of frustration and sorrow. And I'm going to urge everyone, look at the other side. That if your eyesight is failing, maybe it's an opportunity for you to turn inwards, to meditate, to reflect, and to actually develop insight or inner sight, which is something that you would never have done if your eyesight had not failed. If you can't hear so well, it is important for you to withdraw your senses inward and start practicing detachment from the world. Nature has designed all this for us. So instead of seeing it as a loss of our sensory faculties, can we see it as the gain of our ability to go into our inner world of wonder and start working with that? Then there is the atonement of our errors and sins. It is important to be able to be free of that heavy heart and to make your mind lighter, that we travel back into our timeline of the life. We examine all of those people that we may have hurt, said something unkind, difficult experiences we may have had, and we start doing a completion process, a completion of karma with all of them. There's a very simple exercise how you can do it. Number one, how do you know you're incomplete with someone? Think of the people who you don't like, or people you don't want to meet, people who may have said rude things or horrible things to you, and you definitely don't want to encounter them or say hello to them, or if you'd want to turn away from them if you met them at a party. Imagine that they're standing in front of you and do this simple Hopunopono prayer. It is a 4-line prayer, very simple. It's an ancient Hawaiian prayer, which is very effective and very powerful towards completing the karma with those people. The 4 lines are, please forgive me, I am sorry, I thank you, I love you. Now, let's assume that we have a couple of years left in our life, and every day we can spend just 2 minutes thinking of one person that we want to complete with, and we start practicing this. People in our family, in our friends, our colleagues, people who we may have just encountered through our life anywhere, and we've had a difficult or bad experience, and we do the atonement, we do the completion with them. The 5th aspect is detach through generosity. When the moment of death arrives, we are going to be asked to give up something that we have a very deep attachment with, which is our body identification and the ego mind. In order to be able to do that with ease, we must practice this art of detachment, beginning with generosity. So how do we do that? Start with the simple practice. Whatever you have an abundance of, start giving that away. So let's say you have time, you have your attention, maybe you have some skill sets, maybe you have some expertise. Can you start giving your time, attention, skill, expertise to people? Once you have developed this basic practice, then you can move to the next level, which is about giving away things that are precious for you. When I was visiting Bhutan a few years ago, and I met this famous artist who does a lot of work with prayer art. And he said to me, he says, the true essence of giving is only when you're able to part with something that is of immense value to you. So start giving away the things that you value, that you are in some way attached because they are things of beauty, or it's a very rare piece of crystal, or because you bought it on one of your trips and you have an emotional value with it. Learn to let go, practice detachment. And equally important is learning to detach from your ideas, your fixed ideas, your regimented ideas, your thoughts about how life should be. Remember, this is how we will empty out the emotional body, how we will empty out the contents of the mental body. And we need to be empty before the moment of death arrives. There was a very interesting experience that I had with one of my relatives. She was an absolutely joyful person, filled with life, loved the things of beauty, traveling the world, and loved gathering and accumulating things. Unfortunately, she had a very difficult life, and death came to her very, very unexpectedly. She was not ready to die. We had some very intense spiritual discussions just before her death. But what was really interesting is a couple of days after she had died, it must have been about 3 days, 2 or 3 days after she had passed on, I was woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning by her voice, very urgently, crystal clear. I felt her presence by my bedside, and she shared some very interesting things with me, saying, I need you to know that whatever you can overcome, you must necessarily do it while you're still in the body, because it becomes impossible to do it when you move into this plane of existence. Everything from your greed, your attachment, your anger, your bitterness, your resentment. There was a certain urgency in her tone, and she really wanted me to know this because she knew I was doing a lot of spiritual work, and I was working with this whole idea of death and afterlife too. That experience really verified for me everything that I was researching and learning, that if you do not give these things up before, it becomes very difficult in the afterlife. And in fact, the Garud Puran talks about this in great detail. The seventh aspect is, in order to be comfortable with death, which I prefer to refer to as the long sleep. Now, there is the little death, which is the sleep we have every night. We die to the day, we go to sleep at night, and we dream. Death is simply the long sleep. You shed your body and you go into a long sleep before you reincarnate again. And that long sleep, you experience a lot of things which you have not resolved during your lifetime, which is similar to your dreams, except they are more like nightmares. How do you learn to die to the body? By meditating every single day. When you meditate, even if it is for 10 minutes, your body identification starts dropping. So if you have been meditating every single day, number one, you're not so attached to the body. And number two, you will experience the void and the emptiness. That is the end point of meditation. And you will become familiar with that void. And it will become known to you. It will not frighten you or scare you anymore. Now, I'd like to share a very interesting story here. A couple of years ago, the family had traveled to Abu Dhabi, and the children were very keen that we should visit Ferrari World and go on the roller coaster. I had absolutely no idea what I was signing up for. I agreed, much to my regret later, and I discovered that It was the fastest roller coaster in the world at 180 kilometers per hour. I was a complete wreck when I came out of it, but I was shaking like jelly and I had a crying fit that night. But the fact of the matter is, I only survived that very terrible experience because I chose to meditate on the roller coaster. I withdrew all my senses, I centered them in my heart, and I truly believe that that was the only thing that helped me contain my terror and fear that day. Later, when they looked at the high-speed photographs, they were surprised and they said, oh my God, while everybody was screaming and shouting, I seemed to be an image of Buddha sitting there, so peaceful and so calm at 180 kilometers an hour when I knew I was actually terrified inside. So I'm going to urge you all, please, those of you who are already meditating, that is wonderful. Those of you who haven't started the practice yet, please start the practice. It doesn't matter if your mind still seems very noisy when you start, but 10 minutes every day will go a great way in reducing your fear about death. And now, can I request for the second poll? A second poll on, if you were to die tomorrow, what would be your greatest regrets? We've done the G of the golf. We'll come to the O, which is relationship with others. And there is another very interesting story that I want to share with you here. Some years ago, I was called in by the family of a comatose lady. The doctors had given up hope and they had said, if you now want to call in anyone and try any other methodology, then I was called in as an alternative healer to work with her. As I walked into the ICU and I spoke with this, connected with her mind field, I'm able to read people's mind, and I do this work on the rare occasion when I'm called to deal with either MS patients who are not able to speak or with comatose patients who are not able to communicate with the family. And I asked this lady that why it was that she was not improving and getting better. And her response to me was that it is time for me to go. I do not wish to continue anymore with this life. My breaths are getting over. And she asked me for help, which really surprised me. And she says, there is something that I need to complete before that happens. And will you please call in so-and-so person? Now, what I'd like to mention here is that I did not know this family at all. I was just called in as an alternative healer to support them. And so I had no clue who these people were that she was calling in, but apparently she called in her two daughter-in-laws one by one. She then went on to complete with them, seeking apology for all the hard pain or trouble that she had given each one of them, and then said to them that she had forgiven them for whatever difficulties they had caused her. It was an extremely touching moment of completion. These two daughter-in-laws had tears streaming down their faces in the stillness of the ICU, and they were in a state of shock and disbelief that this could have been happening. And for me, it was truly remarkable to see how this soul in that condition had felt so strongly about completing all her karmic ties. At the end of that session, I asked her if there was anything else that she needed. And she said, yes, I am only stretching my breaths because I'm waiting for my youngest son to arrive back from the US. I need to see him because I had promised him I wouldn't go without it. And that was interesting. I came out and I spoke to the elder brother, and he confirmed that indeed the elder one, the younger son, was overseas and that he was returning the next morning. And they were riding expenses. They didn't know what to do, and they'd run out of a lot of money. So this very hesitatingly, this boy also asked me, we really don't know what to do. The doctors keep asking us whether they should remove the ventilator. And I just told him, I said, just wait till you're younger brother arrives. The next day I was meditating, and I felt her presence, and she just said to me during my meditation, she said, "I have come to thank you and to say goodbye. It is time for me to leave now." And the next minute the phone rang, and I was told that she had passed over. So this is a remarkable real life experience that I've had on how important completions are. And it is really and truly important that if you want to have a light heart, please take time out to forgive the people who have caused you pain, people in your own families, and seek forgiveness from those that you have hurt. If you feel that some of these experiences are with people who have already passed into the heavenly realms, you can simply use the Hopunopono prayer I just discussed, and you can imagine their presence in front of you, and you can repeat those words, those 4 sentences in a very heartfelt way, and actually do soul completion with them also. You also have this tremendous opportunity when this awareness arrives for you. So in some families, there are intergenerational conflicts that continue the karmic patterns in those families, and you have an opportunity to end them. So if there is any family with you which you find that for many generations this conflict has been going on, please take the initiative and end it. It will heal your whole family. Having said that, I'd like to talk about science on the other side. So Harvard is doing a study. They're still continuing the study. It's called the Harvard of Adult Development. It is the longest standing that has ever been done. For over 75 years, they have continued it. And they started doing in-depth discussions when this group of people were mere teenagers, and every in-depth interviews to understand from them what are the most important ingredients for good health and for happiness in sunset years. And what's very interesting is that all of us spend our lives chasing success. You know, we want to be rich and famous and accomplished. And what the study has found very, very distinctly is that the secret of happiness and good health in the older age comes from having healthy relationships with your spouse, with your family, with your friends and your community. They had 4 very interesting deductions. One is that if you engage in this, building these connections continuously through life, particularly if you've done them all through and in your 50s, all through the 50s, then you are likely to enjoy, when you're 80 years old, you're likely to enjoy much better pain relief. You will have less physical pain or the experience of physical pain. Secondly, you will have greater degree of happiness. Now, this is not that couples are not fighting or disagreeing. They found that even in couples who were fighting and disagreeing, the degree of happiness was much higher. And it protects your body and your brain from decay and deterioration. And finally, it also helps in memory retention. So as you grow old and the pain and the discomforts in the body increase, you can see pain makes your mind dark and gloomy. And if you wish to be light in body and mind, then it is very, very important that you lean into these relationships with your family, friends, community, so that you can age well and you can love to the fullness of your heart. And I think we have a really, really intelligent group here today, because that is exactly what the previous poll that we just did has also thrown up the same things, that your regrets are that you want to spend more time with your family and you want to feel your feelings more fully. And this is verified by the Harvard study also. There is also, the director of palliative care at Stanford. She issued a 7-point template, which she calls as the farewell letter. I prefer to look at it as a relationship will. And I call it a relationship will simply because when all of you are drawing up your asset will and your legal will, you remember to keep this relationship will alongside it. This 7-point template gives you indications or pointers as to what you should write in that note or that letter, and you should do it while you are still hale and hearty, which is do it today, just like you would do your legal will today. And these 7 points include important people in your life. Remember your treasured moments. Apologize to those who have loved and hurt. Forgive those who love you if they've hurt you. Express your gratitude for the love and care that you have received. Tell friends and family how much you love them and say your final goodbyes. So I would urge you all, please take time to write this farewell letter. So at the moment of death, you will find that it is a very delicate, very emotional, and very, very vulnerable stage. And your heart will be filled and overwhelmed with wanting to say one last time how much you have loved your children and your family and your spouse. Do that completion prior to that moment, because in that moment you have to work very hard towards attuning your mind to the divine so that you can move into the heavenly realms. And so finish this relationship stuff before, because expressing love also needs emptying out. Just like you have to work with all the negative emotions, you have to work with all the positive emotions, because all your moha, all your attachment is coming from here. So this needs to be completed also in advance. And now we come to the third alphabet of golf, which is L, the legacy. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian neurologist. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he witnessed and underwent some of the worst atrocities at the Auschwitz camp. He later on went on to write the book Man's Search for Meaning. And he said that having something to live or die for is what really gives meaning to a human life. Also, at the moment of death, it is seen through the various studies that have been done that it becomes very important for you to be peaceful at that end moment if you have felt that your life had value, that it was worth living, that you did something useful, and that you made other people's lives better in some way through your life. Now, according to Viktor Frankl, your life can have meaning in 3 ways. One way is through your work. What kind of work are you doing presently where you're making a contribution to other? You could be helping someone in an NGO, you could be doing some form of community work, you could be organizing, like Naren is organizing these kind of sessions, which bring so much joy and information and knowledge to all of you. You could have written a book, or it could be something small also. For example, I know that my children love my baked goods and I'm an ardent baker. So I decided one summer I did this project where I have created 2 unique recipe books for them, one for each of my children, so that they can continue to have my recipes after I pass over. So it could be something as small as that, but it makes it, because even after your death, you have left something of value for your children. The second aspect comes from having or experiencing love and care in relationships. Now, I find for a lot of people who are in their sunset years, they get a great deal of comfort from spending time with their grandchildren, teaching them values, ethics, teaching them stories, sharing experiences from their own lives, trying to help them into becoming good humans and transferring their lessons and learnings onto their grandchildren. I think that is remarkable. Or it could be someone that you really love, maybe taking care of a sick spouse, whatever it may be, but a beautiful experience in a relationship also gives your life meaning. And the third thing is making your own suffering meaningful. Now, let's take the example of Nirbhay She has set up the Nirbhaya Jyoti Trust. And despite having a life that is so terribly shattered, I think she's finding meaning and purpose in her life by providing assistance against crime to young girls. Similarly, people who are cancer survivors are aiding other people who are dealing with cancer, or people who have autistic children are helping and providing guidance to the parents of autistic children on how they can deal with those very difficult situations. Whatever it is that you may have suffered in your life, you can really impart and even leave, empty out the lessons of your suffering, because the river must flow on. We cannot leave this incarnation without transferring, passing on to the next generation everything that we learned that we think is of value. So I would urge you all, please use the time that is available to you to inspire other people around you, particularly the younger ones who have so many more years to live, to experience, and to learn from you. There was one of my clients was this young boy, and he was seeing me regularly for some reason. His grandfather would call me more regularly than his parents would. He was just interested in his welfare, and he loved him so much. He had a beautiful bond with this adult child, because this child was 19 years old. He wasn't all that young. And during those conversations, this man who was a retired army general, he spent time talking to me, telling me how he was making use of the last days of his life. He was a member of a very renowned club in the city, and he would write articles in their club magazine. He would speak to people, mentor people on the phone, give them guidance and advice from his life lessons. And he felt so peaceful about doing these things that I never heard him on even one occasion, even until the day he passed over. He had never complained of any of the physical problems, even though he was suffering, because the kind of joy that he received from that purpose, from inspiring others, was so great. And I think herein we can all take a leaf from his book, his life, and actually be inspired to do these things ourselves. The third thing is, even in death, we can make contribution. Now, this requires a lot more, I think, courage, but I'd like to briefly touch upon three very powerful examples. The first one, Randy Posh, who was a professor of computer science at the Carnegie Mellon University, he was called in to give his last lecture. And this was a tradition, but in Randy's case, it was different. It wasn't that he was leaving the university, but it was actually his last lecture because he was dying. He had just been diagnosed with cancer. And the day that some of you may have actually seen that video of the last lecture, it's now a very popular international best-selling book. But when you see his lecture, what is absolutely amazing is that it was a recent announcement about his cancer. He had just got to know about it. He had 10 tumors in his liver. He had been given very little time to live. And yet Randy appears full of joy, full of happiness. He is not at all down or depressed about it. And he just said, I want to make the best use of the time that is left in my life. And in that lecture, he talks about inspiring everybody about fulfilling relentlessly their childhood dreams, which is something that I spoke about a little earlier when I talked about you writing out your bucket list and going for your things that you really want to do that are your childhood dreams, but you didn't find time for them later. So I think Randy has really inspired us all. There is a second example of someone much, much younger, which is Aisha Chowdhury, the 18-year-old girl who died from pulmonary fibrosis, the rare genetic condition that she was born with. It is on her life that the movie was recently released, The Sky is Pink. And she wrote the book, My Little Epiphanies, one day before her death. That book was published. At 17 years of age, Aisha gave a TEDx talk where she said, death is the ultimate truth, and happiness comes from acceptance. So I think running away from this topic of death, avoiding it, is only going to interfere. If a 17-year-old child who's facing death, if all of these people who are facing death are telling us these messages, giving us these messages, if this is the research from people who are standing in the face of death, we must learn from them and we must accept it as a reality. It will come to us and we must prepare for it. The third example I want to mention, again, it is a book that some of you may have read or may want to read after this session, is a book called Tuesdays with Maury, written by Mitch Albom. In this book, Maury is the professor and Mitch is the student. After 20 years, they come together and they spend every Tuesday where Maury shares his life's lessons with Mitch. And the beauty is that in the book, it very clearly reinforces some of the things that I have discussed with you today, which is Maury is really happy, even though he's about to die. He feels blessed that he has this opportunity to say goodbye, that death is not sudden and he's been given this time, that he can live out his dreams, that he can strengthen his connection even with his student, and that he can transfer his learnings and his lessons before leaving. Because all of these things make him feel that his life has had meaning and it has been a purposeful life. So my request to all of you is, please reflect deeply what you would like your life's legacy to be and work on it from today onwards. And now, if we can just do the third and last poll of the day, how would you like to be remembered? Now I'd like to talk about the F in the golf word, which is faith and building faith. And I'm going to go back to sharing a very brief story about my near-death experience. We were coming back from Missouri to Delhi. We happened to take a wrong and ended up driving through the forest. It was very interesting. I don't know how this experience occurred for me, but as we were driving through, I saw there were many trees on the right-hand side. And as we crossed the trees, I found this mantra carved onto the bark of those trees. And I was not familiar with it before, even though I was drawn to Sai Baba, but I saw the mantra Om Sai Ram carved into every tree. And so as I kept repeating it mentally to myself, it became a chant in my head. Now I had a terrible headache, and so I fell asleep. I woke up much later after we'd had a near-fatal crash, when I was sucked back into my body after my near-death experience, and that is a story for another time. But what I want to share here is something different. I was probably one of the worst injured. I had my parents with me in the car. I had my 6-year-old daughter, my spouse, and I was taken to the nearby village hospital. It was a makeshift arrangement. And because I had a head injury and I was bleeding profusely, some of you may be able to see I'm cut all across my forehead. We were sitting in that, I was just laid out on a wooden desk. My daughter was made to sit 1 foot away from me because she had a fractured leg, and the doctors started working on me. Now, the village doctors, they are not refined enough. And while they moved the hundreds of pieces of glass shards from my face and my open wounds, because the entire screen had crashed into my face, I was sitting in the co-passenger seat. They kept saying, oh my God, this woman's life is ruined. Her husband is just going to leave her now because she's been disfigured so badly. And then they went on to operate upon me. I was given over 60 stitches without a single anesthesia, with my child sitting 1 foot away from me. In that moment, even though I was in a great state of shock with the PTSD after the accident, I realized one thing very clearly. If I, as much as made a sound of pain, my 6-year-old child would be scarred for life. And so I just attuned myself to the Lord, and I kept reciting the Om Sai Ram mantra, which had magically been given to me through the forest drive. That is how I survived 60 stitches and the removal of all those glass pieces from my face, and the first surgery was done there. At this point in time, I'd like to just briefly read to you another short passage from my book. The only way to stay calm in such circumstances, and this is another incident that I'm referring to, is to grab the staff of faith, which has many obedient soldiers, among them japa, meditative repetition of a mantra or sacred verse, being my favorite. It was always effective in making my restless and disturbed mind peaceful. I called upon my divine master, and visualizing his image in my mind's eye, began reciting the sacred mantra. In hindsight, it seemed as though something was preparing me for the worst. My knees were beginning to hurt, and my will was quite beaten by now. As I arrived at the short landing further up, which deceptively seemed to be the end of that arduous climb, I discovered to my horror that a narrow chute still remained to be conquered. My heart sank like an escalator experiencing a free fall. "Oh my God," I exclaimed in sheer disgust. There ahead of me stood the narrowest and steepest set of iron stairs I had ever set my eyes upon. There was no way in hell I could get myself to climb up those stairs. "God, I can't do this anymore," I mumbled. "Help me, Lord. Give me strength," I prayed fervently. My legs refused to move, and the dizzy feeling in my head signaled that I was about to pass out. As I leaned against the cold stone wall for support, a strange force began rising within me. Before I knew it, it was propelling my aching body towards the chute stupor. I was pushed up, one labored step at a time, until I reached the very top. How that happened, I still don't know, but I'm quite certain that a certain force mobilized my paralyzed spirit and unwilling body to cover that seemingly impossible distance. The only thing I'm sure about is that it was divine grace alone that lifted me to the deck above. I can't say God who carried me in his arms, but I am sure it was his command that made it happen. I emerged onto the sun-washed deck like an exhausted baby arrives into this world. A brilliant light flooded my being and erased all my fears. As I stood there, exhausted and happy, I was glad to have made this journey from fear to faith. Standing atop the cupola that day, I knew without the slightest doubt that it was faith alone that steered everyone through the difficult passages from birth to death and thereafter. Now, all of us who are familiar with the Hindu tradition know about the reference of the 4 stages of life. There is the brahmacharya, the grihastha, the vanaprastha, and sannyasa. Most of us sitting here, I'm sure, are either in the 3rd or the 4th stage. Vanaprastha literally means prasthan to the vana, which is move into the forest, move away from the worldly existence. And there are 3 things that we need to focus our attention on. One is dedicate ourselves to a cause or a community. 2, contemplation of the sacred texts, understand the essence and the meaning of life. And the 3rd is do good karma, benevolence. And when we move into the 4th stage, which is sannyasa, that indicates a retirement from worldly affairs, where we focus on developing our wisdom mind, and there is a renunciation of gathering and collecting anything more. And that is what I refer to learning to let go, give, everything, material things, give away your ideologies, give away the addiction to your own thoughts and ideas and beliefs, Give away all your anger, your resentment, your poor feelings, your difficult feelings, your good feelings, your love, your attachment, everything. That is the fourth stage. It is also very important that we connect with a good Sangha, people who are like-minded, who are in the search of truth, so that your practice, your sadhana can be strengthened. It could be a teacher that you follow, it could be a community that you follow. The daily practice of satsang increases your ability to do seva, your bhakti, your connection with whoever you think is your isht or whoever you think is the creator of this universe. My father passed away 6 months ago, 2 days after the lockdown in Mumbai. And I am so amazed at the way my mother has handled his passing in these last 6 months. I'm based out of Delhi. We still haven't had the opportunity to meet up because she lives with my brother in Mumbai. Because of this pandemic, we haven't met. And yet, after Dada's passing, she has immersed herself so deeply into prayers, daily prayers, establishing a deeper connection with the divine, doing her daily satsang, spending her time in bhakti, still going about her daily routine activities, speaking to us children regularly. And when I speak to her, which I do every evening, I talk about what happened in her satsang, and then I tell her about the satsang I do. And that is a beautiful sacred moment between the two of us, mother and daughter, and also two souls talking to each other. I speak to her openly about her moment of death, and she is able to share with me exactly what she would like to be when she passes. It is not a dreaded topic. It is a completely open and sacred discussion. And so we can have visualizations about how we want to die. A lot of us want to die very peacefully, and we all think that the best would be if we just go away in our sleep. Let's have those visualizations. I have had a visualization of how I would like to pass. I would like to pass looking out of an open window with my family gathered around me, my children, my grandchildren, me loving them, hugging them, holding them together, having a nice interaction, and then just gazing onto the open sky and blending into the sky as I leave my body. And yet we can have these kind of visualizations, but you know, life can checkmate us. I could end up dying in a car crash. I could end up dying in a very volatile way. So what I've learned through life is be ready and willing to accept any eventuality. The only thing we know is death will arrive. We don't know when it will arrive, and we don't know in what circumstances it will arrive. And I learned this when I had my 2 little babies. The first time I was so adamant about having a normal delivery, and at the last moment there was a complication and I had to have a cesarean. And the second time round, I was wiser. And so I had prepared for all eventualities. The last moment, we did have a crisis and we did have to go through a cesarean again, except this time I was very well prepared. And I chose to keep awake through the process. I took an epidural and I told the doctors, I said, this is the most sacred moment, allowing a soul to enter this life. So it was a wonderful experience for me. And I'd just like to say, these are the 4 things, the practice of golf. I would urge you all, one from each of these 4, if you can include into your daily practice, something that you do for improving your inner growth every day, something that you do to build your relationships, something that you do for your legacy every day, and something that you do to strengthen and build your faith. Now, having done that, we've completed the most complex part of this presentation. There is a very little part which is equally important, and I am going to come to that now, which is how do you get control over the dying process? 7 points that I'd like you to reflect upon. Very important that you think through these points now and then share it with your family so that they know when such a situation arises. The first point is, if you have been diagnosed with a terminal illness, would you want to be told, would you want to be informed about your terminal illness or not? Would you want to be told what you can expect or not? This is very important. Some people prefer that ignorance is bliss. Please don't tell me if I'm dying and let it happen naturally. Some people feel more in control if they know that they are dying. So do you want this to be told to you? Think about it and let your family know about this. The second is, if death is imminent, would you want an extension of life? Now, this is where we come to the question of advanced care directives. 2 years ago, the Supreme Court of India has actually allowed the living will, which allows passive euthanasia. And so you have to give this in writing, of course, that if you are in a vegetative state, is it okay for you to be treated in a certain way? And then there is the third aspect of do not resuscitate. Now, some people who are very knowledgeable about how that moment of death becomes really important, that is the time that you need to attune to the Lord. Now, imagine at that point in time, if you're lying in a hospital and people are thumping your chest trying to revive you, if they're poking needles into you, if they're trying to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, there is so much terror that you will not be able to move into the afterlife easily. And it's terrible. It's not peaceful. So if you do not want to be resuscitated, it is not a legal process, but it can be, your desire can be expressed to the doctors in charge. And you can say that my relative does not want DNR. So please, if you think he's passing, let him pass peacefully. So think about whether you want DNR or not. Then there is the whole idea of home versus hospital. A lot of people are very clear that they want to die only in their homes and not in the hospital. If you feel strongly about that, please let your children and your family know. Even if you have to be hospitalized, the medical staff should let you know when the end is approaching and you should be brought home so that you can pass away peacefully at home surrounded by your loved ones. Then there is the whole point of the farewell letter or the relationship will, which I spoke about, which the 7-point template by the Stanford Director of Palliative Care. Please write that out now itself. The next aspect is about social versus privacy. Some people who have been in the limelight, who have been very powerful people, celebrities, or they have been seen in a certain way, they do not want to be seen in their frail and vulnerable state. Please let your family members know that if that happens to you, then you do not wish to meet with relatives, that they should respect your privacy at that point in time. And it's perfectly okay for you to express that wish. And the next aspect is permission to die. Like I spoke about the comatose lady who was very clear that she had told her son she will not die without seeing him. If you have any such feelings, some people hold on to their last few breaths saying, I want to see my grandchild married or whatever. If you have those kind of beliefs in your mind, then you need to be relieved of those beliefs if the end is approaching. And you need to call your grandchild and say, even though I had wanted to see you married, please give me permission to leave even though you're not married yet. So that permission to die becomes very important. And the last aspect is last rites planning. A lot of times we people can have spiritual beliefs. We can have beliefs about family tradition where we want our ashes to be immersed. And unless we express them, our family and our children will not be able to honor them. So please, these 7 points, please introspect upon them so that you can have more control over your dying process. And I now come to the last aspect, which is the earlier ones were more subtle. This one is most material. There are just 3 points here, which is clearing up your accumulations. The first one is please consolidate all your assets and finances. I find in so many cases, it's a complete mess when a person dies. They have multiple bank accounts, something as simple as that. Please reduce the number of bank accounts that you have. Close all the others which you do not operate on a regular basis. There could be stocks and shares, make sure they're all dematted and that they can be traded online, and those are, you have all your passwords in a certain file. It's best to prepare a file which is marked after I pass, and you put all this documentation into one single file. Then there could be properties that you own, and the legal documents of those properties should also, a copy should be in these files. your LICs and which LICs are not yet matured, who are the nominees to those LICs, your PPFs, all these details. Just make a list of all your financial plan and make sure that they are kept in one single file and that you have simplified the process for the people after you. The next aspect is legal matters, which is writing your will. Again, something that should be done now. And it is a matter of personal preference, whether you want your will to be read out before you die or you want it to be a surprise after you die. The only thing you should try and ensure is you don't want your family fighting over the will once you are in the days when it is moving from the into the Pitru Lok through the Preta Lok is a time, the 13 days it journeys, when it is still looking into the relationship with its loved ones. And you don't want to be disturbed about how they are fighting over your assets. So very important that you think this through and see how you want to handle your assets and your legal matter. And the third one is the simplest, which is please start emptying out your attics, your storehouses, your cupboards, your personal belongings. This is the time to learn, to detach, to let go, to travel light and live a life of minimalism. By all means, enjoy your life. It doesn't have to be a morose thing. You go buy, enjoy something new, buy something new, get rid of the old stuff, just give it away. Anyway, after we die, what are our children going to do? They're going to give it to the kabadi wala or at best to an old age home. So we might as well do the job ourselves. So just give all of those things away. Drop all expectations about the end and simply accept what happens, surrender. And now I want to do another very short reading from a book that I hold in very dear esteem. This is the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. It is essential that the atmosphere around you when you die should be as graceful as possible, as peaceful as possible. The Tibetan masters therefore advise that grieving friends and relatives should not be present at a dying person's bedside in case they provoke disturbing emotion at the moment of death. Hospice workers have told me that dying people sometimes request that their close family members do not visit them just as they are dying, because of this very fear of evoking painful feelings and strong attachment. Sometimes this may be extremely difficult for families to understand. They may feel they are no longer loved by the dying person. However, they should bear in mind that the mere presence of loved ones may provoke strong feeling of attachment in the dying person, which make it harder than ever for him or her to let go. It is extremely hard not to cry when we are at the bedside of someone we love who is dying. I advise everyone to do their best to work out attachment and grief with the dying person before death comes. Cry together, express your love, and say goodbye. But try to finish with this process before the actual moment of death arrives. If possible, it is best if friends and relatives do not show excessive grief at the moment of death, because the consciousness of the dying person is at that moment exceptionally vulnerable. The Tibetan Book of the Dead says that your crying and tears around a person's bedside are experienced like thunder and hail. Thank you very much.